The fog hadn't lifted yet the first time the truck came. It was early October, the kind of Midwest morning where the gravel road out past Route 9 stayed slick with dew until nearly 9 o'clock, and the air smelled like diesel and wet hay. A flatbed truck from Corbeau Furniture Mill, the largest cabinet and furniture manufacturer in the county, rolled slowly down the lane toward the Ashfield place, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop beside an old dairy barn that hadn't held cattle in years. Two workers climbed down. They didn't say much. This was routine now, part of a quiet arrangement between the mill's foreman and the man who owned the land. They dropped the tailgate and began unloading walnut scraps, twisted offcuts, warped boards, oddly shaped blocks too short or too knotted for the mill's cabinet lines. Sawdust drifted through the shafts of morning light like something suspended in water. The man watching them was named Elias Ashfield. 51 years old, broad-shouldered, a farmer by trade who'd sold off most of his cattle a decade earlier after a bad back injury made the daily lifting impossible, and who never quite explained to anyone why he kept the land instead of selling it outright. He watched the wood come off the truck, piece by piece, and when the workers were done, he simply nodded. "Same time next week?" one of them asked, mostly out of habit. "Same time," Elias said. But it wasn't just the wood that made people curious. It was the questions nobody could answer. Why had Corbeau chosen his barn out of every empty property in the county? Why did Elias never once refuse a load, no matter how ugly or warped the boards were? Why did he sort every single piece by hand, instead of just letting them pile up like any sensible person would? And strangest of all, why in 10 years had he never once let a single person step inside that barn? The younger worker laughed under his breath as they climbed back into the cab. "Man's building the world's ugliest bonfire," he said, loud enough for Elias to hear. Elias didn't respond. He just watched the truck pull away, then turned back toward the barn, where the walnut scraps waited to be sorted. Nobody in town could explain why a man would accept truckload after truckload of wood that wasn't good for anything. It wasn't straight enough for furniture. It wasn't dry enough for a wood stove that season. And even if it were, cutting fine walnut into kindling seemed almost disrespectful to the men who worked the mill floor. But Elias never turned a truck away. Not once. Not in the first month. Not in the first year. Why would anyone spend a decade collecting wood nobody else wanted? That question would follow Elias Ashfield for the next 10 years, and almost nobody in the county would come close to guessing the real answer. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people finding opportunity where everyone else sees waste, subscribe to Hardacre Stories. We've got many more remarkable stories just like this. To understand why Elias never turned the trucks away, you'd have to go back further than the mill's first delivery, back to a summer nearly 15 years earlier, when a farmhand named Otto Reinhold gave a younger Elias an old hand plane and a scrap of curly maple, and told him, half joking, that any fool could grow corn, but it took patience to make wood tell you what it wanted to become. Elias never forgot it. He kept that plane on a shelf in the barn for years, untouched, waiting for a reason to pick it back up. The reason came slower than expected. After the injury forced him out of daily farm labor, Elias found himself with hours he didn't know what to do with, and a restlessness that gardening and fence repair couldn't quite settle. He started reading about wood. Properly, seriously, the way some men study engines or scripture. When Corbeau Mill needed somewhere cheap to dump scraps it couldn't sell, Elias saw an opportunity nobody else in the county would have recognized. The seasons did what the seasons do. Snow buried the gravel lane in January and melted into thick mud by March. Summers brought humidity so heavy It curled the barn's old tin roof, and every autumn, without fail, the Corbeau truck returned with another load of walnut nobody wanted. The wood piles grew larger every year, and so did the questions. A buyer from 2 counties over showed up unannounced one spring, having heard rumors of a farmer sitting on a mountain of walnut, and offered Elias a flat cash sum for the entire pile, sight unseen. Elias turned him down without much explanation, which only made the rumors worse. Neighbors driving past on Route 9 sometimes noticed a single light glowing behind the barn's frosted window, long after the rest of the farmhouse had gone dark. Nobody knew what he was doing in there. The rumors changed by the season. Some said he was distilling liquor. Others guessed he was restoring an old tractor, and one particularly persistent story claimed he was building a boat. Of all things, though, nobody could say why a farmer 300 miles from any navigable river would want one. His daughter, Marlene, used to sit on the fence post and watch the trucks unload when she was young, convinced her father was building something enormous and secret. By the time she was in high school, she'd mostly stopped asking, though she never stopped noticing. The way he measured every board twice, wrote small notes on masking tape and pressed them to each piece, built a second shed when the first filled up, then a third. Her mother, Elias's wife, Dot, was more direct about her doubts. More than once, over dinner, she asked him plainly what all of it was for. And more than once, he gave an answer that satisfied nobody but himself. "I'll know when I know," he'd say, and go back to eating. None of the rumors around town were close to correct, and Elias, true to form, never corrected a single one of them. Inside that barn, something far more deliberate was taking shape than anyone imagined. Elias had built simple air-drying racks from scrap lumber, stacking each walnut board with thin wooden spacers between them, so air could move freely on every side. The same slow, patient method professional lumber yards used for their finest hardwood. Except Elias was doing it alone, with wood everyone assumed was garbage. He sorted every board twice, once by species and grain pattern, again by thickness and color, moving pieces between shelves as they dried and changed over months and years. He'd taught himself the craft almost entirely from library books, in long winter evenings with nothing but a single desk lamp and a stack of borrowed woodworking manuals, the same ones he renewed so many times the librarian eventually just let him keep them. He built his first workbench from mismatched lumber. He ruined his first several attempts at furniture so badly that even he, a man who wasted nothing, quietly burned them in the farmhouse stove rather than let anyone see the mistakes. There were nights he questioned all of it. A joint he'd glued and clamped for a week split clean down the middle the moment he tried to plane it, and he sat in the coal barn for a long while afterward, wondering if Dot was right to doubt him. Money was tighter some years than he ever let on. Property taxes crept up. A tractor repair ate into savings he'd meant to set aside, and there were quiet nights he wondered whether the hours he poured into that barn might have been better spent anywhere else. But he kept going. By the 5th year, the barn held more than raw lumber. It held jigs he'd built by hand-sharpened chisels lined up on a wall, a small planer he'd bought used and repaired twice himself, and a growing collection of finished pieces. Small cutting boards at first, then simple boxes, then eventually chairs and side tables that any furniture buyer would have paused to admire. A visiting cousin once caught a glimpse through a half-open door and left more confused than before, describing to relatives a room full of fancy furniture just sitting there, like a museum nobody was allowed into. Then, in the 7th year, a summer storm tore the roof clean off the newest shed. Elias spent 3 sleepless nights hauling boards under tarps by lantern light, terrified that years of careful drying would be undone by a single soaked week. Dot helped him carry wood until her hands blistered, muttering that she still didn't fully understand what they were saving. But she wasn't about to watch a decade of his work rot in the mud. They saved nearly all of it. A few boards were lost. Elias never spoke of that week without a long pause first. He never told anyone what he was building toward. Not because he was hiding something shameful, but because he genuinely didn't know how to explain a decision that made sense only in decades, not seasons. He wasn't collecting wood. He was collecting time, patiently letting years do the work no kiln could rush, waiting for something he couldn't yet name, and risking everything on the chance that the wait would eventually mean something. What do you think he was planning all those years? Let us know your guess in the comments before the story reveals the answer. For nearly a decade, the arrangement between Elias and Corbeau Furniture Mill continued without much notice from anyone outside the county. Then, in the spring of the 10th year, the mill's owner announced the plant was closing. The news landed hard. More than 60 workers lost steady paychecks overnight, in a county where the mill had employed 3 generations of the same families. The diner on Main Street went quiet for weeks in a way people still remembered years later. Trucks that had rumbled down Route 9 every morning for as long as most residents could recall simply stopped coming, and with them went the county's last major source of processed walnut lumber. The timing mattered more than anyone in town initially understood. American black walnut, already a premium hardwood prized for its color and grain, had been growing harder to source nationally for years, over-harvested in some regions, increasingly regulated in others, and squeezed by rising demand from furniture makers who wanted a domestic alternative to imported woods. With Corbeau gone, custom furniture makers and woodworkers across the Midwest suddenly found themselves searching for a source of seasoned hardwood that, only months earlier, had seemed abundant. Elias didn't rush. For weeks after the closure, the barn stayed as closed as it always had been, and if anything, the rumors around town only intensified. Surely now, people said, whatever he'd been hiding all those years would finally come to nothing, now that the mill itself was gone. Then, quietly, he opened the doors for the first time in 10 years. His first visitor was a neighbor building a dining table for his daughter's wedding, who'd heard through a cousin that Elias might have some old walnut lying around. Elias led him past the front of the barn, past the tools and workbenches, toward the back where the oldest boards were stored, and the neighbor stopped walking entirely. Row after row of perfectly seasoned walnut stretched further back than he'd expected, dust drifting slow and golden in a shaft of light from the high window. Boards labeled and stacked with a precision he'd never seen outside a lumber mill. Along one wall stood the finished pieces, tables, cutting boards, small cabinets, each one showing grain patterns that simply couldn't be replicated with quickly kiln-dried lumber. The neighbor ran a hand along a tabletop and said nothing for a long moment. "How long has this been back here?" he finally asked. "Some of it. 10 years, Elias said, give or take. The neighbor didn't just order a table. He asked who else knew about this. If you're enjoying this story of patience finally paying off, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people discover stories like this. Word moved quickly after that, the way it does in small towns when something genuinely surprising turns out to be true. That first table led to a referral, and the referral led to a cabinet maker, 2 counties over driving out to see for himself, who left with an order for a full set of custom cabinetry. A woodworking supplier from a larger city nearby called after hearing about some farmer sitting on the best-aged walnut in the state. Within a year, Elias had more orders than he could complete alone, and for the first time in his life, he hired help. 2 of them, former workers from the very mill that had once dumped scraps at his barn without a second thought. They recognized the grain the moment they saw it. What had once been a quiet, private ritual became, within a few short years, a small but nationally recognized woodworking business. Elias named it simply Ashfield Hardwood and built its reputation the same way he'd built everything else. Slowly, without shortcuts, almost entirely through word of mouth. A regional magazine ran a short feature on the shop, calling it a decade-long bet on patience that finally paid off. Waiting lists stretched past a year. Furniture bloggers photographed his cutting boards and serving trays without ever knowing the full story behind the wood. By the time industry estimates placed the value of Ashfield Hardwood, its inventory, its reputation, and its yearly revenue combined, at more than $700,000, the same workers who once joked about Elias building the world's ugliest bonfire were sanding and finishing boards they remembered unloading themselves years earlier. Nobody ever called it revenge, and Elias never framed it that way either. The mill hadn't wronged him. It had simply thrown away something it didn't understand the value of, and he'd quietly understood it instead, at real risk to himself, for 10 years, with no guarantee it would ever mean anything at all. Today, the Ashfield barn looks almost nothing like it did during those first 10 years of unexplained deliveries. The sheds are permanent structures now, insulated and organized, with a small retail showroom near the front where customers can see finished pieces before placing an order. Marlene, grown now, helps run the business side of things her father never had much patience for. Dot still reminds him every so often of the dinners where she asked what all of it was for and never got a real answer. When people ask him now, and people do ask, now that there's a business worth asking about, how he knew that 10 years of collecting scrap walnut would eventually amount to anything, Elias tends to give the same short answer. I didn't know, he says. I just figured good wood doesn't stay worthless forever. Somebody just has to be willing to wait long enough and risk enough for the rest of the world to catch up. Most people in Willow County saw scraps behind an old barn. Elias saw time, quietly accumulating board by board, storm by storm, doubt by doubt, long before anyone else understood what it was worth. Most people wait for opportunity to arrive fully formed. He spent a decade building it himself, in the dark, out of the very thing everyone else was in a hurry to throw away, never certain until the very end that any of it would matter. That was the difference. Not luck, not timing alone, just 10 years of a man who refused to waste what everyone else assumed was already worthless, and who kept going even when he had every reason to stop. If you enjoy stories where patience, craftsmanship, and quiet determination lead to extraordinary success, subscribe to Hardacre Stories. There's another remarkable rural story waiting for you.